everyone. This is Jim Renacci with the Buckeye War Room. The Buckeye War Room talks about issues affecting Ohio, whether it's voting, whether it's legislation. We've had some great guests over the last few months, and we got a really good guest today, especially since early voting started today. I'm pleased to announce that Frank LaRose, our Secretary of State, is with us today to talk about voting and a number of other issues related to the ballot box. So, Frank, thank you for being on.
Well, thank you, Jim. Yeah, it's exciting. Election season's here, and Ohio's ready as voters are starting to make their voices heard now with the beginning of early voting.
Well, it's great. And like I say, people have already started voting today, but tell people, explain how they can vote. You know, there are a lot of people say, I want to vote early. I'm not sure. Believe it or not, after all these years, they still don't know the process. Can you explain a little bit about it?
I will, and I'm going to talk about why each one may be worth considering and whatever fits best into your lifestyle. It's also interesting to think about early voting for our overseas and military voters started a couple of weeks ago. So those serving in uniform, serving abroad, they've already been receiving their ballots for the last couple of weeks. So yeah, as of today, early voting is underway for the rest of us. It'll go on for the next 4 weeks. Ohio has really more opportunities than most other states in the country. And there are three choices when it comes to voting. If you're a traditionalist and you want to have that in-person election day experience, or maybe a procrastinator and wait until the last day, that's election day voting. 6:30 a.m. until 7:30 p.m. You show your ID, you get a sticker, be an easy experience for you. If you want to participate in early voting, there's two choices. You can vote early in person, or you can vote absentee, which some people call voting by mail as well. Early voting is in person at your Board of Elections. You still show an ID. You still walk out with an I voted sticker. It feels a lot like Election Day voting, but it's done in the 4 weeks leading up to Election Day, again, at your county Board of Elections. You can find that location on our website at voteohio.gov. So early voting is a great, convenient way to do it. There are evening hours, weekend hours. There are very few states in the country that have the kind of early voting opportunities that Ohio has. There's also absentee voting, which is where you get a ballot mailed to your house and you can vote from home. Here's the pro tip for why that may be a good option. When you vote absentee, you're allowed to cheat on the test. Now, Jim, you and I have been involved for a number of years in serving in public office, but even we'll admit that there are times when you get down in the ballot and you're getting to the school board races and the judge candidates and some of the candidates for township trustee or city council, and maybe you're thinking, gosh, which one of those candidates is the one that shares my values that I want to support? And maybe you end up guessing. None of us want to do that. And so when you vote absentee, you don't have to guess. You can flip open your laptop. You can get on the phone with a friend. Take 20 minutes, the time it would take you to organize your sock drawer, and you can be a really informed voter when you mail in that absentee ballot. Now, here's another reason why you want to think about early voting or absentee voting. If you get sick of all the phone calls and the emails and the text messages and the brochures that get mailed to your house, the smart candidates, the smart campaigns will take people off their contact list once they have already voted early. Now, of course, how you vote is a secret ballot, private, known only to you, but the fact that you have voted is publicly known. So again, the smart campaigns get that list from us on a daily or sometimes weekly basis, and they'll stop calling, they'll stop texting, they'll stop mailing things to you, because of course each one of those costs money. And so if you vote early and you get it done, then the chances are you won't get as much in the mailbox or in the text messages that you're receiving.
Well, that's great. And Frank, I do want to ask a question, because there are those people out there that still don't understand. I actually became a member of the Board of Elections. I understand it. You understand it, of course, the Secretary of State. But people will say, well, the reason I don't like to vote absentee is, how do I know my vote's counted? How do I know that my paper ballot was received? Can you explain that?
So a couple things there. First of all, the best way to return your absentee ballot is to mail it in. Some people choose to drive down to the Board of Elections. You're free to do that as well. To be clear, ballot harvesting is illegal in Ohio, so you shouldn't give your ballot to somebody else to take down to the Board of Elections unless it's a family member. That's allowed, or unless it's the case where you're a disabled Ohioan and then you can designate someone to assist you. But really the easiest way is to mail it in. But you can track your ballot at voteohio.gov and make sure it's received by your county Board of Elections. Just like you track a package that you order online, You track that ballot at voteohio.gov, and you know that it got to the Board of Elections because you can see it right there. Some boards will even send you a text message once your ballot has arrived. Here's something else, and this is a thing that we hear from people every year. In fact, I was just talking to a large group of employees at a major Central Ohio company, and they asked the question, well, I've heard that they don't count absentee ballots unless the results are close. Well, that's never been true. That's a completely false rumor, but it circulates. People talk about that. The very first ballots counted are the early votes and the absentee votes. It's intuitive why. The votes that are coming from your high school gymnasium, your church recreation hall, those election day votes don't even get down to the Board of Elections until 8:30 or 9 at night, and then they start counting and reporting those. When you see results at 7:45, 8 o'clock, 8:15 on election night, those are all absentee votes and early votes because they're already there. They've been checked for the proof, the signatures to make sure that you are who you say you are. That's how we check ID for mail-in votes. They're stacked up, flattened out, ready to go through the scanners right at 7:30 as soon as the polls close.
Well, there's another question I hear all the time too, and I just want to run by you. There people say, well, okay, I sent my absentee ballot in. I can go into the computer and I can see my vote was counted. But how do I know that the person I actually voted for was counted? This is, as we know, it's a private ballot. It's not public, but can you give some insight on that as well?
Well, and the same question could apply for election day voting. Once you put it in the ballot box or put it in the scanner, how do you know that the Board of Elections is going to accurately count it? So let's talk about a couple of the things that we do to make sure that your vote is accurately counted and honestly reported on election night. It starts with the way we structure elections in Ohio. They're run by bipartisan teams. I know it seems like Republicans and Democrats can't agree what day of the week it is in Washington, and Jim, you experienced that profoundly. But at your county Board of Elections, it's D's and R's working together. 2 D's and 2 R's run each county Board of Elections. You've been one of the Republican members at the Medina County Board of Elections. Even the staff is half Democratic and half Republican. You go into your polling location on election day. The staff there are half Democrats and half Republicans. And yeah, they keep each other honest, but really work well together to make sure that the process is completely bipartisan and accurate. Even the building is bipartisan. And people are thinking, okay, LaRose, how can a building be bipartisan? At the County Board of Elections, there's 2 locks on the door. One lock corresponds with a key that only the Republican staff members have. One lock corresponds with a key that only the Democratic staff members have. So it's like those old submarine movies in the 1980s where it takes 2 keys to launch the torpedo so one officer can't do it by themselves. Same thing, you need 2 parties represented to even get in the door at the Board of Elections. Let's also talk about post-election audits. I've had people say, well, why have a voting machine at all? If we just had hand-counted paper ballots, by God, nobody could cheat. Well, that's not true either. If you know the history on this, people can cheat with whatever method. You just have to have safeguards in place so that they cannot do that. Heck, Chicago in the 1960s proved that people can cheat with paper. And so we have to make sure that they don't by having redundancies and safeguards. And so in Ohio, we use a voting machine to give you that rapid result on election night. If you didn't tabulate those votes by machine, you wouldn't know the winner for a week or two, maybe Thanksgiving, before you would know the winner of the election. Nobody would be happy with that. So that rapid, accurate result on election night, yes, is added up and tabulated by a voting machine. But 3 weeks later, we count the paper. 100% of Ohio's ballots are on paper, without exception. Whether you fill in an oval or whether you touch a screen and then it prints off a piece of paper, every vote is recorded on paper, and we count those in the post-election audit. So we don't just have electronic voting or just paper voting. We have both occurring in parallel, and then they have to reconcile through a full post-election audit where we count the paper and make sure it matched against the electronic result that you saw on election night. Ohio runs a secure process. Our accuracy rate between the paper and the electronic rate, when we add those up, that rate has been 99.9%. In fact, 99.9 in the 2022 election, 99.98% when you count the paper and compare it to the electronic result.
Well, it's amazing. And you just hit the nail on the head. You also take that paper ballot. I mean, we do this in Medina County, and then you put it through the tabulation machine, and then it shows you what your votes are. So you are actually seeing who you cast your votes for, and then it asks you, is this correct, which is another safeguard. You say yes, and boom, you send it off to be part of the tally.
And then, of course, those ballots by federal law are required to be maintained for almost 2 years. Every board of elections has a shelf with, bankers' boxes full of the old ballots from previous elections. If somebody did want to come in and do an audit or a hand recount or whatever else, as the law allows in certain circumstances. So, listen, there are things to be concerned about, but this idea that somebody's somehow tampering behind the scenes with your ballots, it's just not a reality in Ohio. But what we do need to focus on is making sure our rolls are accurate, that we're checking IDs, all things Ohio does, but in some other states, they don't go to the trouble to keep non-citizens off the voter rolls, to remove deceased voters as frequently as we do, which is done on a monthly basis. And so it's really list maintenance and ID and making sure that you don't allow activist groups to come in and change the rules at the courthouse in the last minute. We fight those activist lawsuits, and the Attorney General and I have had a pretty decent track record of winning those cases because we don't think that you should be changing election laws at the courthouse. We think that should be done at the State House.
And we're going to talk a little more about removal because I know that's a big issue, but I wanted to ask you one other question because I hear this all the time. All right, I put my ballot in, I see it, I push the button, but there could be somebody in some other state or some other country with this computer that's got they've now tagged into that system and they can change my vote. Can you explain that? Because I keep saying the machines are not internet connected, but people will tell me, I don't know what I'm talking about. Can you explain that a little bit as well?
Well, and this is where it's important that people have good information. And I almost think that, Jim, you and I are both conservatives. We support Republican candidates. And these kind of rumors go around and they cause people on our side of the aisle to lose trust in their elections. It almost feels like a ploy to depress, to suppress Republican votes, right? Like if a large number, even 1 or 2% of Republicans believe this stuff and stop voting, that could actually have a big impact on Ohio elections because, as you know, it comes down to a small number often that separates winner from loser. So, yeah, we want to make sure people know voting machines are never connected to the internet. They can't be. The machines that Ohio purchases have no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, no LAN connection. They're strictly air gapped. They're not connected to anything in the outside world. The only thing they connect to is the wall outlet that powers them. And then they're tested before each election through a full battery of tests called the logic and accuracy test. That's happening as we speak at your county board of elections. You can go down and observe them doing that. That's where a Republican election expert with a clipboard and a checklist and a Democratic expert with a clipboard and a checklist stand there and they run each machine through their paces. They put a security evidence seal on them, a tamper evidence seal, so you know that machine has not been tampered with once it's been tested. It goes in that double locked room. And that's done not once a year, not once every 4 years. It's done every election that those machines get tested. And then, of course, that post-election audit where the paper has to match up with the electronic result once again confirms that it was done accurately. This idea that somehow someone is remotely tampering with your ballots, it's just simply not possible in Ohio, and we make sure of it.
Well, and again, by law, because I've had people say, Renacci, you don't know what you're talking about, even though I was part of the Board of Elections in Medina County, that I tried to tell them that these machines they're acquired under the law. They cannot be internet capable. Isn't that correct?
Oh, absolutely. But again, people still want to believe this. We had a thing a couple of years ago where people were going into their polling location and they were told by some social media group to do this. They were taking out their phone and they were seeing if there's a Wi-Fi signal in their polling location, and they were screenshotting it and saying, oh my God, there's Wi-Fi in my polling location. Well, yeah, it's a church, it's a school, it's a library, it's a fire station. Of course, these buildings have Wi-Fi in them, but my coffee mug doesn't connect to it, right? Because it's a device that doesn't have any connectivity to the outside world. And so it's important for people to understand how seriously we take this. People say, can you hack a voting machine? Well, you can hack anything. You can hack a toaster, right? Like if you put your hands on it and you crack it open and start soldering, well, yeah, if you did that, we would catch you and you'd be put in jail for it. We were never going to allow you to tamper with a voting machine. And again, we check them before each election to make sure of that.
All right, so let's talk about voter rolls, because I know this issue comes up all the time and the Democrats complain about it, but how do you determine non-citizens, deceased voters? That's what you're cleaning up. What's the process? How does that work?
This is an incredibly labor-intensive process that Ohio does really well, and other states really should follow our example. It takes a ton of work. I tell our team that list maintenance is like hygiene. Like, we brush our teeth every day, we do list maintenance every day. It's a constantly ongoing process. And think about how dynamic that database of registered voters are. There's 8 million registered voters in the state of Ohio. Jim, since we've been having this conversation, people have died, gotten married and changed their names, moved to a different address. So the voter database is constantly in flux, and so we have to constantly be working to refine it. We have a process that on a monthly basis removes deceased voters. And by the way, that speeds up leading into Election Day, where we're going to do it more often in the month of October to make sure that we're catching those that are recently deceased. This is a bill that I sponsored when I was in the state Senate. We get a list from the Ohio Department of Health on a monthly basis. These are all the people that have died this month. We then disaggregate that by county. And as you know, the counties call it the Steve file. That's an acronym. And they're required to take those names off the voter rolls on a monthly basis. Non-citizens. You must be a United States citizen to vote in American elections. Pretty straightforward. The Ohio Constitution requires it. Federal and state law requires it. And other states, they're not doing this work, but we take this seriously. We work with the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles, which is really the first filter that we go through, and that allows us to identify if there are non-citizens that have become registered. Of course, we work to make sure they don't ever become registered, but in some cases they slip through, and within a couple of weeks we will find them and then remove them from the voter rolls. We also have a single federal database that Department of Homeland Security lets us use called the SAVE database. That means Systematic Alien Verification for Eligibility. Typical federal government stuff, though. This is clunky, not user-friendly. It's not complete either. And so we use that because it allows us to identify some non-citizens and then remove them from the voter rolls. There are 3 other databases that we have been asking for, almost a year now. We've been asking the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, to let us get access to these other 3 databases. By the way, we believe he's required by law to give us access to these, and they will not do that. That is a problem, and that's one of the reasons why at the federal level we need to pass the bill that Chip Roy introduced called the SAVE Act that would put citizenship verification on the front end and give us the ability to access all of these federal databases so that we have a complete picture. But let me say this. This year alone, I have found over 630 non-citizens registered to vote in Ohio, and of course promptly removed them and referred them to county prosecutors because it's against the law. In other states, they're not doing this as aggressively as we are. There's nobody in the country more aggressive about non-citizen registration than I am, but other states are letting it slip.
Yeah, and one clarification just for somebody that was listening. If somebody does vote today or tomorrow, which first day early voting, and then they pass away in 3 weeks before November 5th, that vote is still a valid vote because they were alive when they voted. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so what happens is that once your ballot goes into the queue, into the ballot box, it is secret, right? We can't go back there and see what Jim's ballot was. There's a point in time where you sever the identity of the voter from the ballot to make sure that we can maintain the secrecy of that. And that happens, early on in the process, so people can't go and see how you voted. When it comes out of that secrecy envelope, in the case of an absentee ballot, or when it goes in the scanner, in the sense of an election day vote, that's when your identity is severed from that ballot. At that point, it is just one of the ballots in the box. And so, yes, if somebody passes away during the early voting period, it's already in there. But again, we work to make sure that people that pass away before that are removed from the voting rolls.
But there are people that will try. I mean, that's the one thing. So if you find, for people listening, if you find 400 people that have been deceased and are still on the voting rolls, you remove those. But there's a process. I mean, that people see that. It's not like, Frank LaRose is removing these. It's an open process. Anybody can see who's being removed, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So to go down a little bit deeper on this, because again, I sponsored the bill that did this, so I understand this process. When somebody passes away, the death record is generated in the county where they die. So say you live in Medina County and you go to a hospital in Cleveland and pass away there. The death record will be created in Cuyahoga County. And that's why we have to aggregate it on a statewide basis and then break it back out to the county where you previously lived before you passed away. And to make sure that the Medina County Board of Elections knows that one of their people passed away at a hospital in Cleveland, let's just say. Where it gets harder is if somebody passes away out of state. We do have some availability to work with the U.S. Social Security Administration. It's not perfect. And we work with some other states. But that's where there are other backstops in place. For example, if you go 6 years of inactivity, then we remove you from the voter rolls as well. But if somebody passes away in Ohio, they're removed very promptly. In fact, I've unfortunately had the ability to sort of pressure check this. My family's had a couple losses this year, loved ones from our family. And every time I check within 2 or 3 weeks after they pass away, and I'm happy to say that the boards of elections have been catching that and getting them removed because, again, that's something that we take very seriously.
And like I say, if people are unhappy, they can challenge that removal, which they do. And there's a process for that too.
Absolutely. And listen, anything that happens at the Board of Elections is available for public scrutiny. It can be challenged by the members of the public. And if the Board of Elections makes a mistake, a data entry error or what have you, you're still given the opportunity on Election Day or through the early voting period to cast what's called a provisional ballot. That gets put aside. It's not counted on election night, but it gets put into a separate envelope and set aside. So in the days after Election Day, you can come down to the Board of Elections and reconcile things and make sure that your vote did count.
So a question I hear all the time as well is, well, I'm a citizen and I want to watch the process. Is that possible for citizens to watch the process?
Yes, and the best way to do it is by being part of the process by signing up to be an election official. Every county is always looking for poll workers. It takes half Republicans and half Democrats to do it. It's about 35,000 Ohioans. Now, the good news is at this point, just 4 weeks from Election Day, most of our counties have recruited and are in the process of training the full complement of poll workers. But in some cases, we're still looking. And it's intuitive. It's our urban counties where we need to recruit more Republican poll workers often, and it's our rural counties where we need to recruit more Democratic poll workers. Sign up at voteohio.gov. If your county doesn't have enough yet, they will make you a poll worker. They'll train you, and you'll get to be on the front lines of actually not just observing, but running the elections. You can also sign up to be an observer. Both parties and candidates tend to assign poll watchers. Not as powerful as being an election official, but it gives you a chance to monitor the process. And if something goes wrong, you can call the hotline number that your campaign or your party gives you and report when something is going wrong. And of course, all the meetings that the Board of Elections does are fully open for public comment and public perusal. Nothing to hide at a Board of Elections. We're a completely open book in Ohio because we're proud of how thoughtful and secure our process is.
Well, and again, I served on the Board of Elections in Medina County for a year because I wanted to better understand, and I do understand, and I agree with you. I think when you have the Republican and Democrat doing everything from the keys to the machines to the ballots to even discrepancy ballots, I mean, they got to, if there are issues, they're reviewed by Republicans and Democrats at the Board of Elections.
Jim, this is shocking to us as Ohioans because it's just kind of always been a bipartisan process, so we're used to that here. But in other states, it's not. In some states, like, for example, across the line in Pennsylvania, where you grew up, the boards of elections are really done at the county level. The county clerk runs elections. And if the county clerk is an elected Democrat, then the people that work in the elections office tend to be Democrats. If the county clerk's a Republican, then they tend to hire Republicans to work in the clerk's office. And that's a crazy thing to us. We wouldn't do it that way. We believe in having that bipartisan oversight, but in some states, they still have partisan administration of elections. Well, not in Ohio.
You know, it's funny, while you're talking about Pennsylvania, I have a friend in Pennsylvania who actually worked at the polls this year, and he said that they would turn away individuals who weren't Republicans, who said they were, who weren't Democrats because they didn't show up on the voter roll as a Republican or Democrat. That's an issue for another time, but he was pretty interesting how many people would say, well, I want to vote Republican, and they had been a Democrat for years, or I want to vote Democrat and a Republican for years. We have a process where you vote in a primary, and that's the closed primaries, open primaries, whatever. It was just interesting to hear they have those same issues in Pennsylvania as well.
Well, Jim, you and I have had extensive conversations about this. Yeah, the only way you establish your party identification in Ohio is by voting in a primary. So if you voted for every Republican candidate for president going back to Nixon, but you've never voted in the spring, you're actually not, legally speaking, a Republican here in Ohio, or voted for every Democrat and never voted in the spring. The only way you get party identification under Ohio's law is by voting in a spring primary. But again, that also means that people get to make that decision on primary election day, which you and I have both talked about and are concerned about. We think that you should have to actually establish that party identification in advance so that people don't have the ability to engage in that sort of tactical voting where they're going to go and intentionally vote for a weaker candidate to saddle the opposing party with a bad primary candidate, for example.
Exactly. And that's why Ohio or Pennsylvania does have a closed primary, something I hope we can get here eventually in Ohio as well. But let's talk about issue one. You know, the other thing that your names come up plenty of times in the media about the ballot language and the issues with the ballot language. Can you explain that a little bit and why there were certain individuals complaining about, you know, the ballot language and what, you know, Secretary of State LaRose did?
Well, Jim, I hate to give you bad news, but the mainstream media is incredibly biased for the liberals. Of course, that's not breaking news. We know that. And it's they're at it again, right? We wrote ballot language as part of the ballot board, right? It's our responsibility. I chair that board. It's a bipartisan body. And that's what actually appears on your ballot. The actual words of a constitutional amendment wouldn't fit on a ballot. It's about 13,000 words in issue one. Just how complicated it is one reason to reject it. But 13,000 words wouldn't fit on the ballot. So we have to write a summary. Well, I and my colleagues on the ballot board actually had the temerity to write a really honest summary of what issue one does. It creates an unaccountable board of unelected bureaucrats, and it requires them to gerrymander the state, taking into account no idea about compactness or keeping communities of interest together. It's all based on this idea that they have to achieve what they call proportionality. That means that some number exists out there that they want to set as the target, and they want to gerrymander the state until they get X number of Democrat districts and X number of Republican districts. Well, we wrote the ballot language that very clearly lays this out. We weren't, unfair about it. We just laid out exactly what issue one does. The other side, the pro-issue one side, wanted to whitewash this thing and just say, oh, it's a citizen commission, not politicians, and make it very whitewashed. Well, we didn't do that. We gave Ohioans the blunt truth that they deserve to have. Of course, it was challenged by the Ohio Supreme Court, and of course, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld it, saying, yes, it is honest, accurate information about how issue one would work. And so thankfully, when Ohioans go in to vote, they'll be able to get an honest assessment from the ballot language about what this thing would do.
Well, and I hope even if they don't take the chance to read it when they go to vote, that they understand it before they go to vote, because I 100% agree with you. We're setting up an entire bureaucracy. We don't need any more bureaucracies in the state or federal government, and this would be one.
Well, here's something else to think about, Jim. Just look at who's behind it. As you've known for many years, if you look at who's paying for something, it kind of tells you a lot of what you need to know. And this issue one monstrosity that would completely turn over to an unelected, unaccountable group of bureaucrats to draw district lines in Ohio is being paid for by people not from Ohio. In fact, the $26 million they've raised, we think 85% of those dollars have come from out-of-state, dark money, special interest groups. And we even believe, based on the records that we've seen, that $6 million has come in from a Swiss billionaire. Literally, a guy from Switzerland who has found a loophole and tried to exploit that to fund this issue one campaign. If nothing else, that should give you some cause for concern about who's paying for this thing.
Well, that's important for Ohio voters and Ohio citizens to know. And, it's one of the issues. So much money comes in from outside the state in many cases to drive these issues. And I hope people get to understand it. We don't need another bureaucracy. Right now, it's accountable. There are individuals that are accountable to the voters. We need to make sure the system is accountable. But as well as I do, they framed this citizens over politicians. And we got to get that framing is not true, but they at least have that framed.
Well, and somebody should remind them that we only elect citizens to serve in public office. So the people that you're a citizen and you served in Congress as a citizen. But yeah, this idea that you're going to have some group of unbiased angels, some 15 individuals that are going to come into this and not have any of their own personal bias is foolish. You can't take the politics out of redistricting. It's like saying you can take the wetness out of water. It has been for 200 plus years a very political process because both parties really care about it. What you need to do is put accountable people in charge and then give them rules of the road to operate by and then hold them accountable if you don't like the work that they do. I was part of the redistricting commission, and then a few months later, I was overwhelmingly reelected. In fact, I got more votes than anybody in the history of the Office of Secretary of State when I was reelected. So people didn't have a problem with the way I drew district lines in the totality of evaluating my record as Secretary of State. They overwhelmingly reelected me. Problem with this issue one thing is that these people are going to be completely unaccountable. Listen, Donald Trump talks about this. If you can't fire somebody, they don't really work for you, right? And these issue one redistricting commission people you couldn't fire them.
Exactly. Well, look, I want to thank you for coming on and talking about the election. You got a busy 30 days. I appreciate the work you've done and the work you always do. And look, I think in Ohio, we have safe and fair elections because of you. I appreciate what you're doing. And I realize you're going to be busy for the next 30 days, but we're going to have a good, fair election in Ohio because of you.
Yeah. You'll go to bed on election night knowing the results. Get out and vote, Ohio. It really does make a difference.
That's the key. Well, again, thank you for being on, Frank. And look, for those that are listening in, hopefully you got an understanding, a little more understanding of the election process from the Secretary of State. You know, Ohio is safe. I've worked in the Board of Elections to make sure that I had a comfort level, but you can too, as you heard from the Secretary of State. If you're not comfortable, if you're not happy, get involved, work the polls. Get to be a part of the system and see that in Ohio, at least in Ohio, it's pretty accurate. It's a pretty good system. It's a pretty solid system, and it's something that other states look at. So again, appreciate having our Secretary of State on. I look forward to having more Buckeye War Room reports in the future with guests like Frank LaRose. Thank you again for listening. This is Jim Renacci signing off.